She thought she had won. I keep coming back to that. The look on her face when she walked out of my son's study holding that folder like it was a trophy, like the whole thing was already over and she'd already counted the money. I was still standing in the hallway with my coat on, the one I'd worn to the hospital every single day for 11 weeks, and she looked at me the way you look at a piece of furniture you've decided to throw out. I'm a retired civil engineer. 34 years with accounting, mostly bridge infrastructure, flood control systems, the kind of work where if you get something wrong, people die. You learn to be methodical. You learn that what looks solid on the surface can be rotting underneath for years before anyone notices. I should have noticed sooner. That's the part I have to live with. My name is Raymond. I'm 63 years old, and I'm going to tell you exactly what happened. My son Marcus, my only child, was 31 when he got sick. Pancreatic cancer, the kind that doesn't give you much warning and doesn't negotiate. He called me on a Tuesday afternoon in February, and I remember I was in the garage reorganizing my tool wall, which is what I do when I'm restless. He said, "Dad, I need you to come over." Not, "I have bad news." Not, "something happened." Just that. And I knew from his voice. Marcus had built something real. He started a logistics software company out of his apartment in Phoenix when he was 25, and by 30, he had 42 employees and contracts with 3 regional distribution chains. He wasn't flashy about it. He drove the same truck he'd had in college. But the company was worth somewhere between 15 and 18 million by the time he got sick, and he had substantial investments on top of that index funds, a commercial property in Scottsdale he'd bought as a long-term hold. About 200,000 in a brokerage account. He'd started at 22. Marcus was careful with money the way I'd taught him to be careful with structural calculations. You account for the load. You build in redundancy. He'd been married to his wife. I'll call her his wife because that's what she was legally, even if the word sticks in my throat now, for 3 years. Her name is Vanessa. She was 34, worked in marketing, had a particular talent for making people feel like she was the most interesting person in any room. I liked her well enough at the beginning. She was sharp, funny in the right doses, and Marcus seemed happy. I told myself that was enough. What I didn't understand until much later was that Vanessa had a very precise internal accounting of what things were worth. Not what they meant, what they were worth. I don't think she was born that way. I think she'd been through enough hard years. A difficult divorce in her family, a father who'd made and lost money twice, that she'd developed a kind of financial radar. She was always aware, in any situation, of who had what and how quickly it could move. When Marcus got the diagnosis, she cried. Genuinely, I think, at first, but grief has a way of clarifying people's priorities, and over those 11 weeks I watched something shift in her. Small things. She started asking his business partner questions I thought were strange. She got very interested in the Scottsdale property. She had a long phone call one night that she took outside, and when she came back in, she was quieter than usual, and she told me it was her sister. Her sister lived in Tucson. I had no reason not to believe her. Marcus knew. I understand that now. He knew who he had married, and somewhere in those last weeks, lying in that hospital room, with the machines and the awful stillness of it, he made calculations the way I'd always taught him. He accounted for the load. He built in redundancy. He died on a Thursday in April. Clear blue sky outside, the kind of day that feels like a bad joke when you're sitting inside watching your son's chest stop moving. I held his hand. Vanessa was there. His business partner, a man named Gil, was in the waiting room. I remember the sound the monitors made. I'm not going to describe the rest of that. The funeral was on a Monday. Vanessa handled the arrangements, which I thought was her right as his wife. I stayed at their house. The house Marcus had bought 3 years before, a 4-bedroom in a good neighborhood in Scottsdale, paid for largely with his own money and a mortgage in his name. Because Vanessa asked me to, because she said it helped to have family around. I believed her. I was still half out of my mind with grief, and I think I would have believed almost anything kind that anyone told me. It was 9 days after the funeral. I want you to hold on to that number. 9 days. I was in the kitchen making coffee at 7 in the morning, and Vanessa came downstairs, already dressed, already composed in a way that I noticed but didn't understand yet. She had a piece of paper in her hand. She set it on the counter in front of me and said, "I think it's time for you to make other arrangements." I looked at the paper. It was a letter, printed on plain paper, not legal letterhead, basically saying that as the homeowner, she was giving me 30 days' notice to vacate. I said, "Vanessa, what is this?" She said, "The house is mine. The estate transfers to me. You don't have any legal standing here, Raymond. I'm not trying to be cruel. I'm just being clear. I want to tell you that I argued. I want to tell you I said something sharp and true that made her reconsider. I didn't. I stood there with my coffee cup in my hand, and I looked at my son's wife, and I thought, he's been dead for 9 days, and I couldn't make a single word come out. She left for work at 7:30. I sat at that kitchen table for 2 hours. I want to be honest about what happened next, because some of it I'm not proud of. I didn't hire a lawyer immediately. I didn't call a friend. I went upstairs, I packed one bag with what I could carry, and I drove to a residence inn 12 miles away, and I sat in a room that smelled like industrial carpet cleaner, and I didn't leave for 2 days. I ordered pizza. I watched the Weather Channel. I think part of me was waiting to wake up. My sister-in-law, my late wife's sister Eleanor, is the one who finally got through to me. She called on the second day, and I told her where I was, and she said very quietly, "Raymond, you need to go talk to Gil." That was it. That's all she said. But something in the way she said it made me sit up straight. Gil Rosenberg had been Marcus's business partner since the beginning. They'd met in a coding boot camp in 2016 and built the company together. Gil handling the technical architecture, Marcus handling client relationships and operations. Gil is 40 years old, serious, wears the same brand of gray t-shirt every day, and is the most methodical person I have ever met in my life outside of myself. Key and Marcus were close in the way that men who build things together get close. Not always talking, but understanding each other without needing to. I called Gil and asked if we could meet. He said, "I was wondering when you'd call. Come to the office." I drove to the office, which was in a converted warehouse in Tempe. Gil met me at the door and brought me into the conference room, the one with the whiteboard where Marcus used to sketch out system diagrams, and he closed the door and he looked at me and said, "How much did Marcus tell you?" I said, "Tell me about what?" Gil sat down. He folded his hands on the table and he said, "About 6 weeks before he died, Marcus came to me and said he needed to restructure some things. He was very specific about what he wanted. He'd already talked to an attorney. He asked me to be patient and to wait until you came to me." I felt something shift in my chest. Not hope exactly. Something more careful than that. Gil then explained it to me piece by piece, the way you'd explain a load-bearing diagram to someone who needed to understand why a structure wouldn't fall. Marcus had updated his will and his estate documents 7 weeks before he died. He had not told Vanessa. He'd worked with an estate attorney named Patricia Shields, not the family attorney, a new one he found on his own, paid from a personal account Vanessa didn't have visibility on. The revised documents were filed and notarized. Marcus had also executed a series of what are called transfer on death designations on his brokerage accounts, naming me as primary beneficiary. The commercial property in Scottsdale had been moved several weeks before his death into a revocable trust, which became irrevocable upon his death, with specific conditions attached to it. The house was the one thing Vanessa had clear title to, because it was marital property and Arizona is a community property state. Marcus had known that. He couldn't prevent her from keeping the house, but he'd made sure she didn't get everything else. I said, "Gil, she told me the estate transfers to her." Gil said, "She believes that. She hasn't seen the updated documents yet. The formal reading is in 11 days. Then he opened a folder on the table and pushed it toward me, and he said, "There's one more thing Marcus asked me to show you." It was a letter, handwritten on a yellow legal pad in Marcus's handwriting, which I would know anywhere. I'm not going to repeat the whole letter. That's private. But the part I'll tell you is this. He wrote that he knew what Vanessa was. He wrote that he loved her once, and he was sorry it turned out the way it did, and he didn't want anger to be the thing he left behind. But he wrote that he also knew what she would do when he was gone, and that he couldn't let it happen. He wrote, "Dad, you spent your whole career making sure things didn't fall down. I learned that from you. I tried to do the same thing here. I had to stop reading for a minute." He also wrote that the trust included a specific condition I'll get to. It was the kind of detail that was unmistakably, Marcus quiet, precise, devastating in its patience. In the 11 days between my meeting with Gil and the estate reading, I stayed with Eleanor and her husband in Mesa. I didn't contact Vanessa. I didn't tell her anything. I hired Patricia Shields to represent me directly, which she agreed to because Marcus had anticipated I would need counsel and had already paid a retainer on my behalf. I want you to understand my son, dying in a hospital bed, had paid a lawyer's retainer so that I would have representation after he was gone. I don't have a word for that kind of love. Vanessa, in those 11 days, was not idle. I learned later from someone who worked at the house that she had contacted a real estate agent about listing the Scottsdale property. She had also contacted Marcus's brokerage firm, discovered the TOD designations, and called them to ask if there was any way to contest them. There wasn't. She had also, through her own attorney, sent a letter to the estate suggesting that certain investment accounts were jointly held. They were not. She was very busy for a grieving widow. The estate reading was held at Patricia Shields' office in Scottsdale. Present were me, Patricia, Vanessa's attorney, a man named Bruce who wore an expensive watch and kept checking it, and a representative from the trust department at the bank. Vanessa arrived confident. She was dressed carefully. She smiled at me in a way that I think she intended to be sympathetic and that landed somewhere between pity and condescension. I had nothing to say to her. I sat down and folded my hands, and I waited. Patricia walked through the documents methodically. The house, marital property, to Vanessa. I watched Vanessa nod like this was already settled. The personal property and household contents, to Vanessa. Another nod. Then the brokerage accounts. Patricia explained the TOD designations. Vanessa's attorney looked down at his notepad. Vanessa's smile didn't change, but something behind her eyes did. The business interest. This was the significant piece. Marcus had restructured his ownership stake in the company through a buy-sell agreement with Gil, executed before his death. The arrangement meant that upon Marcus's death, Gil had the right of first refusal to purchase Marcus's share at a pre-agreed price. Gil had already exercised that right. The business, the asset Vanessa had been quietly planning around, was no longer part of the estate. Vanessa said, "Excuse me." Bruce, her attorney, leaned forward and asked Patricia to clarify. Patricia clarified. Gil had purchased Marcus's share. The transaction had closed 30 days prior. It was legally clean. Vanessa said, "He never told me he was doing that." Patricia said, "He wasn't required to." Then we got to the Scottsdale property. The commercial property had been transferred into the Marcus L.A. Hargrove Family Trust, named for Marcus's middle name, which was his mother's maiden name, which Vanessa apparently hadn't known, approximately 8 weeks before his death. The trust was now irrevocable. The terms of the trust directed that income from the property be paid to me for the remainder of my life, after which the principal would transfer to a scholarship fund at the state university Marcus had attended. Vanessa could not touch it, could not sell it, could not contest it without grounds, and the documents were cleanly executed. Her attorney asked if there were any conditions under which the trust could be modified. Patricia said, "There is one condition in the original trust document." I watched Vanessa straighten in her chair. Patricia read the condition aloud. It stated that if the trustee, meaning me, voluntarily elected to dissolve the trust within 2 years of the grantor's death, and if Vanessa remained the primary resident of the marital home during that period, then 50% of the principal would transfer to Vanessa and 50% to the scholarship fund. Vanessa turned and looked at me, and I want to tell you what that look was, because I'll carry it for the rest of my life. It wasn't anger right away. It was calculation. Even then, even in that moment, she was running the numbers. Bruce immediately said that his client would be interested in discussing that option. I said, "I'll need time to consider it." Patricia closed the folder. Outside in the parking lot, Vanessa caught up to me before I reached my car. She said, "Raymond, I know things have been difficult. I know you're grieving. I'm grieving too." She put her hand on my arm, and she said, "Marcus would want us to be able to move forward. He wouldn't want this to be a fight." I looked at her hand on my arm. I thought about the letter on the yellow legal pad. I thought about 9 days. I said, "Vanessa, I'll be in touch through Patricia." She called 6 times over the next 3 weeks. Twice to my cell, twice to Eleanor's landline, once to Gil, once to Patricia's office. The calls to my cell, I let go to voicemail. She wanted to talk. She wanted to find common ground. In the last voicemail she left me, she said, "I just need to know if you're going to be reasonable about this. That's all I'm asking. Whether you're going to be reasonable." Reasonable. I played that back a few times. Here's what happened on the financial side, because I want to be clear about this. The Todd brokerage accounts transferred to me directly, approximately $215,000 after taxes. The trust income from the Scottsdale property. The building was leased to two commercial tenants, a dental practice and a physical therapy clinic, on long-term leases. Monthly income after expenses and management fees was roughly $4,200. That wasn't a windfall, but for a retired civil engineer living modestly, it meant security. It meant I didn't have to sell my own house. I had a paid-off place in Gilbert I'd kept after my wife passed, or touch my pension. Gil made me a fair offer for Marcus's share of the business. I didn't take it. Instead, I asked if I could become a non-voting silent partner with a small retained interest, just enough to stay connected to something Marcus built. Gil said yes without hesitating. That meant more to me than the money. The business partner condition, the thing Vanessa's people tried to contest, was reviewed by a probate court in Maricopa County 6 months after the estate reading. Vanessa's attorney argued the buy-sell agreement was executed while Marcus was mentally impaired by illness. Patricia presented the medical records, the testimony of Marcus's physician, and a signed statement from the notary. The agreement had been executed during a period when Marcus's cognition was fully intact. The court found no grounds for contest. Vanessa was left with the house, the household contents, and the personal property. The house had a mortgage. Marcus had refinanced it 2 years before for a renovation, and the mortgage was not small. She had no access to the business proceeds, no access to the trust, and the brokerage tithes were legally airtight. I heard from Eleanor months later that Vanessa had listed the house, that she'd had trouble keeping up with the mortgage on a single income, that she'd moved to an apartment in Chandler. I won't pretend I felt nothing when I heard that. I'm not a saint, and Marcus was my son, and she looked at me like I was furniture 9 days after I buried him. But I also didn't feel what I expected to feel. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired mostly, and underneath the tired there was something that might have been peace, or might have been just the absence of dread for the first time in a long time. There's one more thing. About a year after Marcus died, I was going through the boxes I'd recovered from the house. A neighbor who'd been friendly with Marcus held on to a few things for me, including some files from his home office. Inside one of the folders I found a single index card in Marcus's handwriting. It said, "The structure holds if the foundation is right. You taught me that. Love, M." He'd left it there deliberately. Of course he had. I framed it. It hangs in my garage now, above my tool wall. My son is gone, and there's not a day that goes by when I don't reach for the phone to call him and then remember. That's the part no legal document and no amount of careful planning can fix. The grief is not structured. It doesn't have redundancy built in. It just is what it is, and you live with it, and some days are better than others, and some days you sit in a residence inn watching the Weather Channel, and you can't explain it to anyone. But the thing he built, the thing he protected, that stands. The scholarship fund at ASU has already paid for a first-generation student's junior and senior year. I met her at a ceremony last spring. She's studying civil engineering. She wants to build bridges. I told Marcus I'd watch what he built. I'm watching. People ask me sometimes what I took away from all of this. Like there's a clean answer. Like grief comes with a lesson printed on the back of it that you can just read off and move on. It doesn't work that way. I can tell you what I observed, though. I watched two people respond to the same situation. My son's death, his estate, the weight of what came after, in completely opposite ways. Vanessa moved fast. She moved with absolute certainty that speed and aggression were the same thing as winning. She had the house, she had the furniture, she had the lawyer with the expensive watch, and she operated from the assumption that none of us had thought further ahead than she had. Marcus moved slow. He moved 6 weeks before he died, quietly, without announcing anything. He paid a retainer with money she couldn't track. He signed documents on a day when he was lucid and calm, and his physician could attest to it. He left a letter on a yellow legal pad that he knew I would eventually find. Every single thing he did was deliberate, patient, and almost invisible until it wasn't. I spent 34 years calculating structural loads. The basic principle is this: the thing that fails is almost never the thing you are watching. It's the thing that was under stress for years without anyone noticing. Vanessa was watching the house, the business name, the account balances. She wasn't watching the trust documents. She wasn't watching the buy-sell agreement. She wasn't watching a father and a son who had spent 3 decades teaching each other how to build things that last. What I keep coming back to, when I think about Marcus, is that he wasn't operating from anger. That letter made that clear. He wasn't trying to punish Vanessa. He was trying to protect something he'd built and someone he loved with the only tools he had left. That's not vengeance. That's integrity. There's a difference, and it matters. The hard lesson for me, the one I didn't want, is that I missed things I should have caught. I liked Vanessa because she was sharp, and she made Marcus laugh, and I wanted him to be happy. I wasn't paying attention to what she valued at a fundamental level. I was watching the surface. I was watching the presentation. A man who spent his career checking what was underneath load-bearing structures went home and stopped checking. That's on me, and I carry it. What I know now is that the qualities that saved the situation, and I use that word loosely because nothing saves you from losing your son, were not dramatic. They weren't loud. Marcus didn't confront Vanessa. He didn't make threats. He sat down with an attorney he found on his own, and he thought carefully, and he executed documents with precision while he still could. That's not a Hollywood story. That's just a man with integrity using his intelligence in the time he had left. I think that's what I want people to take from this, if they take anything. The choices you make when everything is falling apart reveal exactly who you are. Vanessa revealed who she was in 9 days. Marcus revealed who he was over 31 years. Those are both true at the same time. The scholarship student studying civil engineering at ASU. I think about her a lot. She has no idea that the money came from a man who died before she ever applied. She just knows someone believed her education was worth protecting. That's the structure Marcus built when everything else was falling. That's the one that holds.